Morning everybody. Thanks for braving the heat and the humidity to come out today to Maritime Memories. My name is Georgia and I'm the local history advisor for Cleveland Council, based here, the Wetlands Council based here at Cleveland Library. So today we're going to talk about all things maritime, all things nautical. Before we begin though, I'd like to acknowledge the Quandamooka people as the traditional owners of the land, water and the seas on which we meet today, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I recently moved to Cuchimudlo Island and I've spent most of my adult life living in cities and inland regional towns, and I suddenly find myself living on an island and obsessed with all things nautical and all things maritime. It's a funny experience to go from being a mainland liver to an island. And every morning I jump up and I catch my barge or my ferry to the mainland, and I watch all the locals jump into their tinnies and head out to the bay to go fishing or check their crab pots. And I'm always asking people questions. Have you seen a dugong? Have you seen a shark? Have you been to Peel Island, Lazarette? Have you sailed the South Passage? And everybody's got a story to tell me. Some of them are a little bit more fanciful than others. This morning, whilst waiting for the ferry, we saw two turtles swim past, and one of the local gentlemen was telling me about the best place to see dugong off Coochie. It's a complete way of life up there, and one of the deckhands was saying to me the other day, I said, Troy, have you seen any sharks? And Troy said, yes, I have. A shark jumped out of the water yesterday and it did two flips in the air and went back into the water. The next day he told the story, the shark had jumped out of the water 3 times. So like all good fishermen, the story gets bigger and better to tell. So the bay is key to the development of the Redlands area, and its importance is undeniable to both Quandamooka people and European people alike. Today we'll look at some of the local stories which centre around Moreton Bay, tales of sharks and shipwrecks, of tragedy and triumph. So Aboriginal people have lived in this area and along the coast for tens of thousands of years. With a plentiful supply of marine food, canoe travel to the islands was a part of daily life. Fishing was common. We know that the Quandamooka people travelled to Cuchimudlo to gather the ochre for which Cuchimudlo Island is named for. Regular trips made, wow, I broke it, were made in bark canoes. So on the left here, this is a scar tree, and if you're lucky enough to travel to Cuchimudlo, ooh, that feedback's so good. That's probably the humidity getting in there. So this is a scar tree, and there's one out on Cuchimudlo Island. So scar trees, they're amazing. They're usually hardwood trees. You can take the bark off it and they make bark canoes. There's quite a few in Cleveland and out in some of the islands, along with some amazing shell middens and some stone tools as well. Now these images, they're not from our local area, but they're fantastic in showing canoes as a part of daily life. The picture on the top left is it's from Port Macquarie. It's around 1905 and it's children out fishing. The bottom one is from Cairns. It's an outlet canoe, and that was from 1890. The ethnographic record and Quandamooka stories tell us of the importance of this beautiful expanse of water to the traditional owners. Interaction between communities, island and mainland was very common, especially for trade, and they would canoe out to Minjerribah or Stradbroke and exchange the bunya nut for pippies. One of my favourite stories is about the bond between the Aboriginal people and the dolphins. Aboriginal men would go into the water and they would call the dolphins by slapping the water and digging in the sand with their spears. This would call the dolphins, and the dolphins would herd the fish into gutters that had been dug by the Aboriginal people. Once enough fish had been caught in the nets, the rest of the fish would be given back to the dolphins to eat. I think it's a fantastic story that shows that beautiful relationship between nature and people. So, from one fin to another, I have to talk about sharks. There's been so much publicity at the moment with sharks. So many social media feeds show 20 bull sharks heading into the river. And living on an island, it's a constant question. I say to people, do you swim much off the beaches of Coogee? Oh no, there are too many bull sharks out there, the sharks will get you. You'd have to be pretty unlucky, but I'm still a little bit wary about it. We have an endless fascination with sharks, which is evident from the success of movies like Jaws. Jaws was released in 1975, and didn't we all watch it and suddenly become terrified of sharks? I spent summer where I decided to watch all 4 Jaws movies, I think it was. I was living at Brunswick Heads at the time with my mum. So I sat there and I binge watched Jaws. I couldn't swim for weeks afterwards. I'm not likely to get taken by a shark, but he did a good job of making me terrified. The movie, it is a tad ridiculous, and it did create a lasting impression and deep-set fear of sharks for so many people. I heard recently that somebody interviewed Spielberg about making Jaws and what he thought, and he basically expressed a regret in actually having made it because of this fear of sharks it created in people, and it probably did lead to an increase in shark deaths as well. We both love and we fear the deep blue depths. They're full of mystery and secrets. Now, the genre of nautical fiction, it tells stories of life at sea, exploring the complex human relationship between the sea and its uncertainties. Herman Melville's Moby Dick, written in 1851, and claimed by some as the greatest book ever written, and Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, are 2 classic examples of good nautical fiction. Our cultural obsession with sharks is a long and very complex one. I read recently that sharks re-entered the Western psyche when the seafaring surge began in the 15th and 17th centuries. Some of these movies are utterly ridiculous, but I've watched them all. So Sharknado, Jaws, there's a massive, massive cultural obsession with nautical fiction. It's evident by the amount of shark movies you can get onto Netflix or Stan and watch. With an abundance of shark movies ranging from the terrifying to the utterly ridiculous, these movies feed our fear and they fuel our fascination. But what's the likelihood of being taken by a shark? In 2020, there are only 26 shark attacks in Australia, resulting in only 8 fatalities. Considering how popular our beaches are and our love for the ocean and our rivers, you'd have to be pretty unlucky to be killed by a shark. So what about in Moreton Bay? I've been told by Coogee locals of sharks seen chasing dugongs onto the beaches of Coogee. Not sure. I've also read a story of an unfortunate gentleman called George Grant, he was in the port of Brisbane in 1904, and his hat blew off. So George has decided to jump into the river and get his hat. Not so good for George, he was eaten by a shark. There are also many, many, many stories of shark attacks in the Brisbane River. It's funny when you read the articles, shark attack articles in the early 1900s were pretty graphic, pretty gory. I read some, I thought I can't show these. The journalists would write about flesh being torn off the bones. It was quite horrendous. There was no holding back, that's for sure. Newspapers love a good headline. Man-eating sharks, it always gets a run. This large article on the left talks about a shark attack on a dinghy that was anchored off Peel Island. In this attack, the blade of the steering oar was bitten off apparently by a shark. Now the article goes on and it writes, a very exciting story told by one of the Brisbane pilots in which a hungry monster over 18 feet long had been hovering near anchorage for several hours, whilst an attempt was made to catch the brute. So to catch this shark, they grabbed that night's dinner, which was a big side of mutton, they filled it with dynamite and they used that as bait to catch the shark. Not very sporting, but yeah, they got the shark. It seems the attitude of the era was always to kill that which you fear. With headlines warning of man-eating sharks, it really didn't help raise the profile. And the way the sharks were killed most of the time was to be shot, or let's blow them up with a pound of dynamite. Let's look a little bit closer to home now. This is a tragic tale of a young boy called William Thomas Fielding. So this story begins with a day's sailing. They were heading out to Snipe Island. It's the 30th of December 1905 and Mr Outridge takes a local group of children out in his 22-foot long Sharpie boat with a 10-foot dinghy in tow. Now this family, it's also interesting, the Outridge family, Sell Outridge Park, is named after this family as well. They're quite a prominent local family. So on board were 7 children, including Willie Fielding and Elsie Atho. They arrived out at Snipe Island, jumped into the dinghy and rowed ashore. It was on the way back to the actual boat that things went bad. There were 4 people in the dinghy, 2 girls were waiting in after it, and one of the boys was pushing the dinghy out to the deeper water. That's the actual boat. That's what was called a sharkie. So when the 2 girls tried to climb into the boat, it capsized. Now Mr. Outridge, he managed to get most of the children on board, except for poor Elsie, who was found unresponsive in the water, and she couldn't be revived. They went looking for William Fielding, but he had disappeared completely. But that's not the end of the story. It was a month later in January 1906 when there was a Dr. Ham who caught the government steamer, the Miner, out to Dunwich. He was out there fishing off his boat whilst it was anchored when the group noticed a massive shark swimming around. They decided to shoot it and drag the shark on board. And once they dragged it on board, they realised there was something inside the shark. They cut it open and inside were the remains of poor William Fielding. It's a truly, it's a bizarre story, and the father had to identify his remains. It's a terrible story. Williams was interred out at Serpentine Creek, so that's his memorial there, and it is the biggest and grandest memorial in the cemetery as well. Amity. The amount of people I know that go fishing and surfing out there, I think are crazy. The amount of shark attacks and shark sightings is staggering. I've heard some spectacular stories from locals, so take it with a grain of salt. But there's a lot of sharks out there. Man-eaters, once again, they're referred to man-eaters. Now, this article was published in 1930. It's essentially a tourism piece. There's a group of gentlemen that decided to go on a 2-week cruise around all the islands of Moreton Bay, and they write this massive article, it's just a short part of it, and they publish it in the local papers, extolling the virtues of how wonderful the bay is and what the islands are like and the fishing. They get to Amity Point and they walk the 14 miles to Point Lookout. It's a really interesting article. I've cut a lot of it out, but they were talking about what it was like to walk the 14 miles, and they were told, make sure you don't pack a lot because you have to carry it, and they were all advised to use their sand shoes as pillows. Turn them over and jam them together. The man who wrote this actually said it made a sufficient pillow. So they walked around to Point Lookout, and that article describes the steepness of the cliffs and the gorges and how unfortunately the local dog that was with the group fell off into the water below. That then engages them all in conversation of, oh yes, if I fell off the cliff, I'd just swim to shore, she'll be right. So they're all talking about how easy it would be to survive that fall and swim to shore. By the time they get around to the end of the walk at Point Lookout and look into the waters below, they say they plainly see large numbers of man-eating sharks from 10 to 15 feet in length. This abruptly killed the conversation about swimming through any of the waters around that island. With so many sharks they were seen swimming along the waters, they realised they'd never survived that. The headlines, when you go looking through Trove, the National Library of Australia's database, and type in shark attack, the headlines are fantastic. These are some of the stories that I grabbed from Trove whilst I was having a look. In January 1927, we have the headline, Sensational Fire. A 44-foot motor launch which belonged to the South Coast Oyster Company caught fire. Now Arthur Cripps, he was a gentleman on board at the time, so he jumps overboard into shark-infested waters. He manages to swim to the dinghy which is behind the launch, but later told journalists that sharks were hovering around and I quickly got the dinghy away from the burning boat. Even after I had stranded my dinghy, I saw sharks as I was wading in 2 or 3 feet of water. Another article tells of a shark that jumped out of a fishing net and fastened its teeth onto a man's shoulder. Then there are the sea snakes, the serpent-like creatures 7 foot long called at Wellington Point. The sea snake was shot and it was then taken to the museum as a specimen. You do wonder, there's such a reputation with fishermen telling fanciful stories of the one that got away. I often wonder with these stories just how big the shark was or how many of the brutes were actually swimming around at the time. I think there might be a small amount of fishermen's creative licence in some of these. Let's meet Thomas Welsby. A lot of you would have heard of Thomas Wellesby. There's a lot of streets in the area named Wellesby Street, Wellesby Avenue. So Wellesby was born in 1858 in Ipswich. He was a prominent politician, sportsman, company director. He was also very heavily involved in the Historical Society of Queensland, and he wrote prolifically. He was always writing articles for local papers. So his article at the bottom, he's also called Father Neptune of Moreton Bay. That tells you how many articles he wrote about Moreton Bay and the marine life. In 1924, he wrote an article on sharks. Now, once again, the article's written from a sporting point of view. However, he does write about the feeding habits of sharks and a few other insights that he's noticed. Once again, though, Wellesby refers to them as man-eating brutes. In another article, he writes about fishing off Peel Island. Once again, it's 1924, and he writes how they sailed to Peel Island with buckets full of burley, ready for the sharks. And the quote in the article says, "We left Peel with the hearty good wishes of the fishermen, their love of killing sharks being almost equal to mine." Wellesby was also responsible for ensuring that the remains of a 38-foot-long humpback whale, which became stranded and died near Amity Point, found its way to the Queensland Museum. And as chairman of the Queensland Amateur Fishermen's Association, he publicly protested the high price of fish in 1930. The price increase was justified due to scarcity of fish in the bay, but Wellesby categorically stated that there was absolutely no decrease in fish numbers in the bay. The bay was teeming with fish. I love this picture of Wellesby. I think he looks ruggedly handsome as a sailor. It's a top photograph. Unfortunately, the other industry that Wellesby promoted was dugong hunting. Dugong were hunted for their oil, their tusks and their bones. Now, I practiced this presentation at home for my sister, and she's gone, "Dugongs don't have tusks." And I thought, oh my gosh, I've got this all wrong. They actually do. The males, the old males have tusks, and the extremely old females, they often have tusks as well. I think they're related to the elephant family somewhere in the chain of evolution. So Wellesby, I find him something of a contradiction. He writes almost passionately about the dugong. He writes about their sensitive and their timid nature, yet he still advocates the hunting of them. Since I started doing this presentation, I've become a little bit obsessed with a few things. The dugong is absolutely now my biggest obsession. My mission is to see a dugong. Has anyone seen dugongs? Yeah. I haven't, and I'm desperate to see one. Living on an island, I was told there's a gully out from Flinders Beach on Coochie. So if you can walk sort of 30 metres out at low tide, there's this deep gully full of seagrass. And apparently a lot of the dugongs will go out there for a bit of a graze.
Yeah, that walkway out to Wellington Point.
Yeah.
When the tide's really, really low, you can see it. It must be like just a big drop off right there.
And you've seen them there?
Yeah, and there are a lot of them. There's big beds of seagrass everywhere there.
I love them. I absolutely love them. So the beautiful dugong, I think it's beautiful, along with the manatee, has also been accredited as the mammal believed to be the inspiration for mermaids. I love this story. This is, it's funny when you start researching something on maritime. Poor Jill, I get off on all these tangents and Jill's like, just got to rein it in, just got to rein it in. There's so many interesting stories. Living on Moreton Bay, it's hard to focus on just a few stories when the whole area is just teeming with amazing stories. So early explorers, having seen the faces of the manatee as it rose to the surface, mistook them for mermaids. And on the 9th of January 1493, on his first journey to the Americas, good old Christopher Columbus spots 3 mermaids while sailing near the Dominican Republic. Now, in his journal at the time, he writes, 3 mermaids which rose well out of the sea, but they are not so beautiful as they are said to be, for their faces had some masculine traits. So what Columbus actually saw were manatees, which are closely related to the dugong and are the 4th species under the order Sirenia. Now it's interesting, when we say order of Sirenia, the first thing you think of is sirens. And that name Sirenia was actually taken from the word sirens from Greek mythology. I love that connection, the fact that mermaids are a myth, but when we're categorising this new species, we'll give them Sirenia as a sort of an accolade through to sirens. I think it's beautiful. So these beautiful creatures are listed, they're vulnerable species, and there's only about 600 to 800 of them left living in the Moreton Bay Marine Park. This is the southernmost dugong population on the east coast of Australia. Oh, I love them. Moreton Bay is a beautiful expanse of water which is home to an abundance of marine life, bird life, and, amazingly, 360 islands. It's an incredibly busy waterway and one which can be very treacherous to those who are unfamiliar. Full of constantly shifting sandbanks and mudflats, many a ship has fallen victim to the hazards. So before we get into looking at some of the shipwrecks that have happened in these waters, I just wanted to have a quick look at the Amity. The Amity had such a paramount role in the local history of this area. The Amity was a 142-tonne brig, or a two-masted vessel, which played a really vital role in the settlement of the colony of New South Wales, remembering that Queensland at this time was still part of the colony of New South Wales until 1859. The Amity was built in 1816 in Canada and was purchased by Governor Sir Thomas Brisbane in August of 1824. So the reason that he purchased her was that she was to be used to establish and then support the proposed convict settlement of Moreton Bay. The Amity set sail from Sydney in 1824 under the command of John Oxley, the Surveyor General, and she arrived in Moreton Bay on the 10th of September 1824. So the settlement was established at Redcliffe, but it was moved 8 months later to the Brisbane River. But the important part, I think, is when the Amity set sail from the return journey to Sydney in October, she sailed via the South Passage, and she was apparently the first European vessel to actually chart that course through the treacherous South Passage. That's the replica of the Amity in she's in Western Australia, I believe. Navigating into Moreton Bay, it's funny, when I was looking at this, it all comes down to North Passage, South Passage, or jumping pin. And I speak to a lot of people, a lot of boaty friends out in the islands, and I'll say to them, have you ever sailed the South Passage? Oh, yes, we sailed the South Passage, but it consisted of somebody standing in front of the boat going left, 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 right, trying to dodge all the sandbars. They did it, but they said it was the most nerve-wracking experience of sailing that they've ever had. I also think to go through the North or the South Passage in a dark, starless night, battling big seas with storms without the technology we've got today, and to hear the waves crashing on the nearby rocks would be quite horrendous. So the North Passage above Moreton is obviously the safest option, but it's also the longest option. Now the South Passage is obviously the most direct, but with many a captain facing numerous delays in their voyages, I think the temptation of the shorter South Passage proved too much and they took it, irrespective of the dangers. Then there's Jumping Pin at the bottom. This passage lies between North and South Australia and it's so dangerous that even now people are advised not to sail it. Alright, so 1861 map. What's different about this map? Yes, I love this map. Strategy, she's still one island at this point. We'll talk a little bit about this later on. It does relate to a shipwreck story I've got further down the track. There have been many shipwrecks in this area in the last 100 years. We'll look at just a few of them today, but we'll start with the Rufus King. Now she ran aground off Amity Point in the South Passage in 1942 in spectacular fashion. So American Liberty ship the Rufus King. She was on her maiden voyage from Los Angeles to Brisbane via New Zealand. And she was loaded with military supplies. Some people have said the supplies were estimated at about £3 million worth. Somebody said to me in one of these talks I did recently that the reason she snapped in half so easily was there was obviously an engineering or a design flaw. Yeah, ships obviously shouldn't break in half that easily. Oops, go back. On the 2nd of July 1942 at about 8 a.m, she ran aground off Amity Bar, and it appears that the captain thought that the lighthouse he was looking at on Point Lookout was the one on Cape Moreton. Very quickly the Rufus King snapped in half. I read somewhere that the front had refloated to New Guinea, where it became a workshop for people in New Guinea. Now this is the canvas Wallace. I think this photograph is just spectacular. She was a Scottish barque with a steel hull and 3 steel masts. Like the Rufus King, she was on her maiden voyage. Like the Titanic. No, there's a lot of similarities. No maiden voyages for me. She met with tragedy just off the coast of Stradbroke Island. So this is 1894, where Straddy is still one island. Jumping Pin, which I found out means big fellow wave, is the narrowest part of the island, and it's also the place where the breakthrough occurred. The canvas walrus went down here just near Swan Bay. She'd sailed halfway around the world, so what went wrong? So under the command of Captain Leggett, the canvas walrus left Glasgow on the 8th of May 1894 full of cargo. She was plagued by continuous terrible weather and actually took 8 weeks to reach the Cape of Good Hope. The weather was so incredibly bad that 2 of the lifeboats were washed away and the iron deckhouse was staved in 2. It was 5 a.m. when the ship struck ground on Monday the 3rd of September in 1894. Now, the skipper, he believed his location to be at Moreton Island, but not wanting to round Cape Moreton at night amid stormy weather, he decided to slow the ship down and just wait for dawn. He was actually 89 miles south, right down the bottom of where he thought he was, and at 4:50 a.m. the second mate raised the alarm saying that he could hear breakers. The steel ship then bottomed out in the sand whilst the waves kept pushing the ship towards shore as she started to break up. There's so much in a lot of these maritime talks. I find it interesting that lighthouses, they obviously serve a purpose and they save lives, but the amount of human error where they say, oh, I thought I was looking at Cape Moreton Lighthouse. No, you're actually looking at a different one. There's been a lot of stories of, a lot of it's obviously human error. The steward, Robert Birch, when he was warned of the situation, decided to lock himself in his cabin with the comment, no use in losing one's head. He was one of the unfortunate victims whose body was found on Monday afternoon. So the rescue attempt began when Jack Reed volunteered to swim ashore with a line, but he became entangled in the line and was battered by the cargo and the wreckage. The rope caught around his neck and he was dragged aboard unconscious. That was Gustav Kindmark who actually made it to shore and managed to go for help. Most of the crew jumped overboard and swam to shore. Now the aftermath of the wreckage was all this cargo was strewn up and down the coast. Cases of whiskey, spirits, salt and even dynamite. And of course the whiskey didn't stay on the shore very long. There's a lot of articles written in the paper about people who decided to knock off a few cases of whiskey.
Thank you, I just can't keep. Thanks so much.
Of a crew of 27, 6 men perished in the tragedy and they were buried in the sand on Stradbroke Island. So this is the memorial that was erected on the site, which used the transom from the lifeboat, which had the ship's name on it. But later on, a few Brisbane-based sailors got together and they collected some funds to build a more substantial monument. They also added a section of the wheel to the monument. Now remember how I said that some of the cargo that got washed up, apart from the whiskey, was a case of dynamite? Well, what happened to that dynamite, you ask? Well, the 1898 government of the day decided that they would just detonate the dynamite where it had landed on the beach. The result was that it weakened the sand dune and created a massive hole. So later that year, when a big cyclone hit, it broke through the now weakened sand dune and subsequently now have North and South Stradbroke Island. I didn't know that. I thought, I read that and I was talking to my mum, like, oh mum, guess what? Well, I thought that was common knowledge. It's fantastic. It's that terrible alignment of events, isn't it? You know, dynamite, shipwreck, cyclone. Unfortunately, when it did split through, it took the graves of the sailors out to sea as well. Another little obsession I've developed is for ship's figureheads. Oh, I think they're stunning. This is the figurehead from the canvas walrus, obviously. Mr. Downs, so he was the proprietor of the Railway Hotel in Southport, in Scarborough Street in Southport. He visited the site and thought, oh, we'll take her home, stick her in front of the pub. So he towed her home and she stayed in front of the pub for 35 years until she was so riddled with termites that she had to be removed. Now, I didn't know that the symbolism around figureheads I think is so interesting. So they're usually women, animals and warriors. They're usually sexy women, I found out, because sailors are sailors. And they were always on the bow of the ship. They were the face of the ship as it ploughed through the water, and they were meant to protect the sailors and bring good fortune and good luck. This is why today we use the term figurehead when we talk about a leader who has no real authority or power. Now this is the Countess of Derby. She was another barque of 329 tonnes built in 1831 and was wrecked off Moreton Island in 1853. Under charter, she left Sydney on the 14th of October 1853 en route to Cleveland, where she was to collect wool and other produce to take to London. But just off Point Lookout on Stradbroke Island, the captain decided that to save on daylight hours, he'd take the southern and more direct passage. Instead of the safer North Passage, he went through the South Passage, and very soon he ran aground. So word of the shipwreck was carried to Brisbane by the local Pondamuka people. It's interesting, the involvement of Aboriginal people in assisting the victims of shipwrecks, and it was actually very, very common. Many a time they saved the lives of those who would have died through exposure or through drowning. When it became clear after several days that the vessel could not be refloated, the captain and his crew and 2 passengers abandoned the ship and they landed on Stradbroke Island. They camped there until smaller vessels could take them to Brisbane. Now, the wreck, what was left of it, was apparently sold at auction for £29. One of the most tragic events to happen in the history of Moreton Bay shipping was the wreck of the steamer the Sovereign in the South Passage in 1847 with the loss of 44 lives. The Sovereign was a wooden paddle steamer owned by the Hunter River Steam Company. She was built in Sydney in 1841, and originally she was only running short trips between Sydney and Newcastle. She was ill-equipped for ocean conditions. The whole point of the steamer was inland river trips and short coastal trips. It's a long trip to come up here. She wasn't designed for long, long trips. And like other steamers of the day, she was incredibly overloaded with goods. It was only a matter of time until something happened. She made her first voyage to Brisbane in 1843 under the command of Captain Henry Cape. Now the Sovereign would carry livestock, wool and other goods, but she also carried passengers. So on board at the time was the Gore family. Mr. and Mrs. Gore, with 2 children and their maid. They were lost in the disaster, and it gives me goosebumps to think about it, but just before they sank, Mr. Gore was heard to exclaim, "Mary, there is no hope for us now, we shall all go to heaven together." All the local papers obviously picked up the story, and they quoted as saying no less than 7 families have been bereft of parents in consequence of this severe calamity. The boat was smashed to pieces incredibly quickly, leaving all passengers clinging to whatever they could find. Of course, a lot of them grabbed the wool bales to hang on to, but they became saturated and sank very, very quickly. There were 54 people on board and only 10 were saved, including the captain and Richard Stubbs, who was one of the cabin passengers. Richard Stubbs showed amazing heroism in his attempt to help all the passengers, and it's likely without his help, everybody else would have drowned as well. So a boat crew, including many Indigenous men from Amity Point, were dispatched, and assistance came from some local fishermen as well. This is such an interesting story. So Richard Stubbs then gave a really detailed account of what happened with the shipwreck, and he told of how the local Aboriginal men from Moreton and Amity basically saved their lives. He quoted, "They swam us to land, took us to their camp, they tended our wounds and they wrapped us in their blankets while they dried our clothes. They set food before us and they treated us with every mark of the most heartfelt pity and commiseration. I shall never ever forget the debt of gratitude we owe them or the risks they ran in saving us." So Thomas Wellesby, once again, he picked up the story and wrote about it in the papers as well, and he managed to get 6 of the 7 names of the Aboriginal men that were involved in the rescue. This is the actual memorial. That's the translation of what's on that. In the plaque. It's such a sad story. The involvement of Aboriginal people is it's heroic. Now for a boat of a different kind. This is the Walrus. In 1872, I've also heard it was in 1869, possibly situated on the Logan River. Now this unusual looking vessel was a travelling sugar mill, but on the side she was also a rum distillery. So she was a river steamer built by local man Taylor Winship, who also built the Hawk and the Swallow. So the Walrus, basically, she would sail around from private jetties and she'd collect sugarcane from people that grow their own sugarcane, but didn't have the facilities on site to process it. So she'd sail up to the jetty, she'd get the sugarcane, they'd get on board and they'd start to process it. But they were also processing a lot of rum. In the first year of production, she produced 14,000 gallons of rum. I read in one of the newspaper articles on Trove that the inspector for distilleries was really unpleased about this situation. He said it was hard enough to monitor the production of rum on the mainland, let alone following a boat that was charting up and down the coast and down rivers. So she ceased operation in 1882, and there's so much more history about this that I didn't have time to go into, but how the Beanley distillery, there's a follow-on from the Walrus to the production of rum at Beanley. If you like rum, it's a great story. And the other thing about local production around here in the early days of the 80s is, I did read somewhere that when they were producing rum, they sold the 30% proof overseas, but they always get the 40% for the locals. But what about the people who lived on our islands? Who were some of the earliest local inhabitants? There are a lot of convicts, both ticket of leave and escaped. So one of the earliest that I read about on Lamb Island was Thomas Lucas. He was a ticket of leave convict who lived at Corroboree Point from 1853 until his death in 1893. He owned a lot of land from around 1887, and his grave is on the hill above the jetty. So Thomas Lucas, obviously Lucas Passage is named after Thomas. And I read somewhere that, I was trying to find out records of how he died, and there's so many conflicting stories that he drowned, or the convict records are usually great, but doing some of this research was quite problematic. And we have another convict on Russell Island. This is John Clowes, who started a small oyster shell burning business in 1850. Now, lime burners were springing up all over the coastal areas at this time as the demand for lime to use in cement, it was growing as the expanding colony needed more cement. It became the prime industry. So Clowes was one of the first lime burners to operate in the Redlands district. So the way a lot of the early people gathered their oyster shell was to go and steal it from the existing Aboriginal Indians, unfortunately. So it was an easy haul. They'd go and dig it up and they'd use that. They then started using live oysters, which was not great, especially when they realised the value in the live oyster trade. That's an oyster cutter, and yeah, this is from up north, but I still think it's a great photograph of oysters, leases. So Macleay Island has another interesting settler called Tim Shea, who was an escaped convict. So Surveyor Robert Dixon originally called Macleay Tim Shea's Island. That's Tim Shea's waterhole, which is apparently where he lived. So Tim Shea was an Irish convict transported in 1826 for murder, who arrived at Moreton Bay in July 1827. He was then sent to Dunwich to fell trees, where he took off, he escaped and lived on Macleay Island for 12 to 14 years. Now Macleay, Jill and I have been discussing Tim Shea at Macleay for weeks now. Trying to research convict records is usually pretty straightforward because they're so accessible. Now Tim Shea, Timothy O'Shea, I found nothing to verify that he ever existed. The story is there and it's become part of local law, but trying to prove it is really impossible. I've seen dates from the 30s, dates from the 27s. I read somewhere that he escaped and was recaptured after 14 years and sent back to prison. But then another record I saw recently said that he took off from Dunwich, not realising that his ticket of leave had just come through, so he was a free man anyway. So he spent 14 years hiding out the island, but he was essentially free. See, local history, it's quite a complicated process. It's never a linear process of research. There are so many twists and turns that happen along the way, and I find myself constantly going off on tangents and looking for facts or for proof. And Tim Shea was one of those elusive figures. But irrespective of the lack of evidence, Shea is now part of this local history of Macleay Island. The local stories that we are told, then we retell, they gain a legitimacy in every time we retell them. What is true, what is local legend? In the end, does it really matter? I mean, it's now become part of the fabric of that island. I wasn't going to talk about this, but I had to. Stories like the mysterious wreck of the Spanish or the Portuguese galleon on Stradbroke Island. Apparent sightings of the skeleton of a ship in 18-mile swamp on the east coast of the island have only added to the mystery and the romance of this story. So the whereabouts of this ship have disappeared. There was a theory that the local Aboriginal people knew and they were passing it down through the generations, but somewhere along the way it's just died out, if it ever happened. The story's become a local myth, and the fact that we can't validate it, it's almost irrelevant. To me, it's another fantastic local story, and let's be honest, it's probably the most interesting story around. I know it's out there. We're going to look for it, Jill. So Moreton Bay was also home to the flying boat service from 1953 to 1971. Whilst the construction of the Hamilton Wharf was impacting on the flying boat service, they decided to move it down here. Beautiful things. This is just a map of the flight paths that they took around the islands, around Snipe Island, Anakin Island and Vicky Point. So the first flight was on June the 1st, 1953, and it was Ansett and Qantas that operated all these flights. The community reaction to the flying boats was a bit mixed in this area. So shortly after flight operations began, the Reverend fruit growers, they met with airline officials to negotiate freight arrangements on behalf of the 600 members. However, the Victoria Point farmers were complaining that the salt water was damaging their tomato crops as the planes flew overhead. The last flight was in October 1971. So before we end today, we'll just talk about a little bit about a bit of a darker chapter in the history of Moreton Bay. I'm doing another talk next month on island history and island life, which I will go into Peel Island. I could do an entire talk on Peel Island. There is so much history and so many stories out there. So Peel Island, who's been there? Has anyone been to the Lazarette? Oh, I'd like to talk to you. So Peel Island, throughout time, islands have always been seen as perfect places to isolate people, to imprison them and to quarantine them. In 1874, the quarantine station, which was on Stradbroke Island, was relocated to Peel Island, where it remained until 1906. So the method of quarantine has varied over the centuries, but basically the concept, in the light of COVID, this should not surprise anybody. The concept of protecting the public health by restricting the movements of individuals who may be harbouring serious disease has remained constant. We isolate people during pandemics, obviously. So in an age of seafaring which relied on visual signs such as flags to communicate with people, the hoisting of the yellow flag was absolutely dreaded. It conveyed to port authorities that there was a contagious disease on board, yellow fever for example, and that passengers on board that ship had to be quarantined. And when I was researching this, flags are still used today, and it makes sense. If you're sailing in the waters of a country and you don't speak the language, hoist that yellow flag. Or, it's the main visual aid in sailing, which I think is really interesting. So opening in 1907 and in operation for 50 years until it closed in 1959, Peel Island was home to over 500 people, and there are still 200 people that are buried out there today. The fear of leprosy amongst the community was so great that unlike other highly infectious diseases, smallpox and syphilis get a big write-up at the time. Leprosy sufferers were so feared that they were banished to the islands. They were literally dragged out of their houses. The articles in Trove are just horrendous. These are a couple of photographs of, that's Rose Donovan, her memorial, in the matron's quarters. Shrouded in a cloud of fear and misunderstanding, some of those who were banished to Peel Island, they didn't even have Hansen's disease. There are so many tragic stories. There's allegations of mistreatment, reports of escapes, sadness, loneliness. There's also love stories out there. Families were torn apart by this disease. Babies born at the Lazarette were forcibly removed from their mothers. The disease wasn't transferable during pregnancy anyway. And in some situations, a non-infected family member chose to move to the island to be with a family member. In 1900, the likelihood of contracting Hansen's disease was like 1 in 200,000. It's actually quite a hard disease to catch. Not like passing somebody in the street and picked up leprosy. It took months and months of constant exposure. So one of the newspaper articles referred to that gruesome, contagious and loathsome disease that has struck horror in the hearts of humanity throughout all history. And it is throughout all history. I think the Bible writes about leprosy and Hansen's disease. So another article writes about the marriage on Peel Island between Leah Goldsmith and Samuel Rose. Both were long-term residents of Peel. They'd been there for 4 years and 6 years respectively, and they were sufferers of Hansen's disease. The interesting thing about that article, it was written in 1950, which was 9 years before the lazaret closed, and it finally gave recognition to the fact that leprosy was the least infectious of the infectious diseases. The social stigma was beginning to ease from leprosy as treatments were beginning to improve. The article at the bottom is fantastic. This woman decided she'd had enough and she wanted a weekend out, so she took off from the island. She went to, there was some exhibition happening in the area. She had a great time. She spent up all her money and she went to the local police station and said, right, I've run out of money, I've had enough, I want to go home, please. And she refused to tell them where she'd stayed. She adamantly said, no, I've washed all the sheets, I've disinfected everything. There's no need to worry, no one's going to catch leprosy, but I just want to go back. So there's some funny stories that come through all the tragedy that surrounds Peel Island. And when Peel Island became a leper colony, there's so many articles written about how the local fishermen are in uproar because now the island has become a closed place. They're no more fishing off Horseshoe Bay. So when researching for this presentation, I was constantly distracted by something I'd read or a photograph I saw or a story that I'd tell. The bay and the lifestyle that it affords us is something we have enjoyed since people first came to this area, and it's something that we still love. The fact that Cleveland Point was favoured by some as a preferred location for the Port of Brisbane is a clear indicator of the importance of Moreton Bay. We live on the beautiful islands, we swim in its waters, and I for one am so grateful to enjoy such a lifestyle. That's Coochie Mudlow, moonrise. You can't take a bad photo on the bay. So each day we are creating new stories and new histories for future generations, such as the rare sighting of the saltwater crocodile. Stories become local history, and this is just another one that will go into the archives. Sure, you can't prove this one way or another, but it's now the storytelling. It's now part of our storytelling. I love this. This has done the rounds so many times. I love it. Absolutely, Crocodile Dundee too. We're also looking to increase our local history collections. If anyone has any photographs they would like to donate, we are always open. There's so much history out there that we don't have and stories that we haven't been told. So we have an open door. If anyone wants to drop in and share stories or photographs, we'd be great, absolutely grateful for them. So some of the upcoming talks. I just realised when I was putting this together that I am so obsessed with maritime, everything up until May is about the water. I'm sorry about that. So Island Life is the next one, which is on Friday the 10th of March at Victoria Point Library. Then we have a cemetery walk at Redland Bay Cemetery, which will be fantastic. That's on the 22nd of April at 10 a.m. And then we've got a guest speaker coming in. So on the 25th of May, we've got Dr. Jodie Frawley coming to talk about oyster farming of southern Moreton Bay. I've heard her do a talk up at Wynnum and she's fantastic. Thank you everybody for braving the heat to come here, I appreciate it, and that's Maritime Memories.